Welcome to Red Hen Radio, a podcast brought to you by Red Hen Press. We're a nonprofit publisher fostering diverse stories every year. On this podcast, you'll get to hear from the people who are inside the literary world, the authors and publishing professionals who are working hard to keep independent literature thriving. Stay with us as we introduce you to today's segment.
So good afternoon. I'm Kate Gale. I'm the publisher of Red Hen Press and delighted to be here with Luke Goebel and Amy Speace. It's a great time to be here with you as your books are launching in 2026. So Amy, I'd love to chat with you a little bit about your book. I think many people think of songwriting and poetry as overlapping. I think some people think of them as somewhat interchangeable skills, but you might have a different opinion. You might feel that songwriting is one skill, writing poetry is another skill. Obviously, you are a singer-songwriter and you have now written a book of poetry that's coming out. So did you think of that as a very similar skill, or you are hopping from one thing to the next?
I think it's like same religion, different sect. So like if poetry is Catholic, songwriting is like Southern Baptist or something, something like that. It's like the skills and the listening. There's a lot of similarities. So when I came to poetry, I started poetry before I started writing songs, like a long time ago when I was a kid, but I wasn't really very serious about it until a few years ago. So when I came back to it, I think being a kid poet helped me be a very attuned lyricist to my songs. My lyrics in my songs have always been called poetic. And I have a lot of symbolism and metaphor and alliteration and a lot of the technical terms that we use for poetic language. I didn't make them by choice. They just naturally come from me into songs. And so when I switched and I became a poet, I realized I kind of had a lot of those skills already naturally in place. As a songwriter, I also have rhythm in my writing because when I write songs, I feel a groove as the lyric is coming. People always ask me if the music or the lyric come separately, and mostly as I'm writing a line, I can speak it out loud and find out if it's a ballad or a rocker or a powerful pop punch. So I use that skill in poetry, and then I kind of make choices about things like the structure, the form of the poem based on the breathing of the rhythm, and all that is musical. The thing that I realized I lacked when I went into my MFA program was it's a completely different tool of communication, whereas with songs, you only get like the 3 minutes to hear the song once. So even if you're using poetic devices as a songwriter, I really have to be very clear with the story I'm telling and with the message I'm trying to state so that the listener just gets one time through, and with the music helping them, they're like, I get this song. I get this story. Whereas with poetry, you can allow more space and ambiguity for either the sort of structure, the form of the poem, the blank space on the page, for instance, the reading of it to inform the meaning. And then you get 3 or 4 times through a poem. I sometimes don't catch a poem until I have read it through and then speak it out loud. So they're hand in hand, but they're very different technical skills. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I know one of your teachers was Doug Manuel, who's a Red Hen poet, and he grew up with music. His father owned a record store, and one of his books that Red Hen has published was kind of an homage to that record store. And I know you've read it, but he's very deeply entrenched in music and now teaches classes on music and hip hop and poetry and how they're intertwined. I know you've had some interesting conversations with him about the relationship between poetry and music and how much music influenced him becoming a poet. Do you feel like those conversations really helped you understand yourself as a poet?
Oh, totally. Doug was instrumental for me in giving me courage to write from my rhythm. It's funny. He also taught me about rap because I'm a folk singer. So his Sugar Hill Gang was my Joni Mitchell. And we just jammed for the whole summer. We were working together on the rhythmic dynamic of poetry when you're coming from a sort of a song fan place. I was actually going to write a whole critical paper on this, and he was like, you got to listen to this. And I was like, I cannot talk about rap. I know nothing about it. But since then, he's really gotten me into some really great hip hop and stuff like that. But we really love the language play of the music that comes from the African American element. So if you go back to things like train chants or anything that was like a work song, there's like a groove to that song because you're trying to get a rhythm so that you can do the work. And that went into gospel. And that feeds in through Elvis to white folk music. I mean, I could go on. This is like my nerding out on language and music and rhythm for me, because I'm like a very non-professional ethnomusicologist as well. I just adore American roots music and where it comes from and the different rhythms of each instrument used. And so I explore that in my music, but it's fun to now explore it where the music has to be written into the word, and the groove and the rhythm, the drum beat has to be written into the word. I like to play with that as a composer, that I'm kind of composing the music, but just with the sound of the word. And I know Doug does that so well. And when he performs, he's doing that. So I love watching him do his poetry because he's so musical, and so he's just like grounds himself in the earth when he's speaking his poetry. I'm such a fan of his.
Yeah, I am as well. And I like to think about that intersection between poetry and music. And for myself, when I'm editing poetry, if it's not feeling quite right, I always like to read it out loud when I'm reading my own poetry or someone else's, because it's hearing it that allows us to understand what's going on. And I think that when we're editing prose, we tend to read it out loud as well, which moves us over to discussing Kill Dick, Luke's book. So I wanted to say something as an introduction to this book. I first entered LA with an introduction to the film industry. Everyone I knew worked in the film industry. My kid's dad worked in the film industry. And so it felt to me like the big stories being told in LA were being told through film. And so I wanted to, start a publishing company so that I could see stories being told in other ways. But it took me a while. Once I had gotten it started, though, I was really obsessed with Carolyn C's book, Golden Days, and with Day of the Locust, because both of them to me were sort of the quintessential books that had these big narratives that retold the American dream. And the California dream is the American dream, but in neon. The person isn't looking to marry just a wife and live in a house. The house has to be by the ocean. They don't want a dog. They want a pet dragon. And the wife has to be Pamela Anderson, sort of an exotic version of the American wife. And the whole thing is in neon. And then because it's a California dream, there's going to be an apocalypse, and there's going to be sex and drugs and music and a swimming pool and this whole sense of chaos that you have in Day of the Locust. And so I was looking for that novel because I felt like that really made us a big California press. And as soon as I read Kill Dick, I was like, this is it. This is it. And at that point, my husband and I had been traveling to Greece since before the 2008 crash, and then I'd been to Vietnam. And so I was sort of becoming obsessed with this whole idea of the global South and the global North and this big wealth disparity that I feel like you feel in California, especially in LA and San Francisco. And I felt like this book had all of that in it. And I feel like a really big novel that's going to really hit in the way that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest did has to be an idea that meets a moment. And I feel like that's what this novel does, because it has that big moment of the wealth disparity, the chaos that's happening right now in this country, and that sense of darkness, and that whole sense, though, of how we're all kind of paying attention to this in this very odd way. Like if you think of that whole kind of Luigi moment, that was an odd way of things unraveling in the way that in this book, the pharmaceutical executive is being observed and his life is being unraveled in a way that is also very strange. And so I feel like the way this novel tangles and untangles is going to very much hit a nerve. And so I'm very excited about it. I think that this is a big book. With that, Luke, tell us about your coming into this. And I'm also curious, when the whole thing happened with Luigi, were you surprised, or did it seem like that was inevitable given everything that had happened with Big Farm in this country and so on?
It's nice to be here with you, Amy and Kate. I think that I mean, I guess when it happened, it's that thing of like, I created everything. I've been living in this like Ouroboros of creativity, and now it's starting to inhabit the world around me, which of course is ridiculous and not true. But at the time, I was like, torn with that sense of like, well, this is good for the book, but is it good for the world? And there was another strange thing that happened when there was actually like someone who was killing homeless people in LA, remember? Like a couple of years ago. And that was really shocking and upsetting, especially since that's the subject of the book. But I guess looking back, it makes sense. It's inevitable that we live in a shock economy and that we're all like inundated with media and feeling like it hurts our souls to be watching and witnessing everything that's happening in the world constantly and choosing not to do anything about it. Right. And that's a choice as well. And so when someone takes action like Luigi, it harkens back to like the 90s, when I was coming into my consciousness of like what was happening with Earth First or Animal Liberation Front or other direct action. Obviously, those are different. Those entities espoused and mostly tried not to hurt people. But it does make sense that like people feel this devastation of just being inundated with negative systems. And I think that that's what an LA book really does, like Nathaniel West, Day of the Locust, which was a huge influence, one of my absolute favorite books. I think that like an LA book and California too with Steinbeck like looks at systems, how systems work, and that like the riots in Day of the Locust are inevitable. The violence in LA, these things are in the wind, they're waiting. And that's why I think an LA book so well speaks to this larger culture of America and of the world, is that there's just this impending sense of like catastrophe and calamity that's waiting for us. Characters don't like come into the world and the world gets built around the characters. The world's already fully formed in it, right? The characters are here and have lost innocence before they ever even take their first breath. And so I think with Kildare, it's like we look at these systems like Purdue Pharmaceuticals and the Oxy epidemic, and we look at systems like what's going on with the current administration, and look at anything, and it's like these are just systems of power that repeat themselves over and over. When Purdue Pharmaceuticals gets called by the Kentucky courthouse to deliver evidence that they misled the public about their drugs, they drop 1 million documents on the courthouse, These systems are really successful. And I think that the thing about an LA novel is that it reveals the inevitability of calamity. We used to look at like LA, at least when I was growing up in this little town in Ohio. Everyone was like, my parents met in the Christian cult, and the people that I was raised with, my friends' parents and stuff, they were like, don't turn on the TV and don't watch that VHS tape. Satan is in Hollywood. The idea used to be like music is evil, film is evil, but like LA isn't evil. LA is just accurate. It just captures what society really is and has been reflecting that mirror. And we just didn't want to accept it, the truth of it, but that's what makes an LA novel great. Like the big sleep, the corruption and the systems are all in place. And it always usually just comes down to like a few rich people, maybe in the same family, who don't want to talk about what happened at home. So they tear up the whole world.
Yeah, I feel like your book moves through those ideas in a way, though, that also ends up being very entertaining. When I've talked with different people, especially young people, about the book, sometimes people will say to me, I got stoned and read through the whole book in a couple of hours, and I thought it was just the most entertaining book. And I realized that the book has these different levels. You could just read through it as a dark thriller and be completely entertained. And so one of the questions that you end up asking yourself as you're reading this is, I kept thinking, Luke is making a extremely profound point about the darkness of pouring drugs into the poorest community and what that does to us. And at the same time, he's asking himself the whole time he's writing this, are you not entertained? And that's the big question of our time when you're writing a novel, because if you're going to get it out to a lot of people, if you're going to make a point to a lot of people, you have to keep asking that question. And in Bill Dick, there is an eventual standing up and saying no. So yeah, I feel like you're doing a couple things at once here. You've written this very entertaining book and you're making these big points and you're asking big questions at the same time.
It all comes down to like the fact that this book was born because my brother died of an oxy overdose. And so it's that Sophoclean dilemma of what do you do? Like, what do you do to bury your dead? What do you do to honor your dead? What do you do when somebody did something that at least partly killed your blood? And then, it's like, it's fun to have fun. Like, I'm not going to ask anyone to read something that isn't doing 3 things at a time in each sentence, and I think that's where it gets back to like music. And my first interest was lyrics. I grew up in this little town with like 2,500 German Catholics. My dad was Jewish, but like it was mixed with monoculture. And like the only thing that I really had access to was the music that he brought. Some of it was like, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, like the folk albums. And some of it was like, Neil Young, Who I Ended Up Meeting, or The Dead, or this or that, and a lot of Bob Dylan. But like later I found that like Harry Smith had preserved all that music and that he intersected with the beats and sort of the counterculture movement that I later became interested in. But that was all entwined in all of that. And so like, the idea that protest would be clever or have a sense of humor or be intelligent wasn't new. That was my origin, was if you're going to hit, you got to hit with something that fires at a lot of different levels and is funny and is tragic and is lyrically brilliant and maybe like stacks up a bunch of double spondies or like does a bunch of things poetically that are interesting and that, are happening at a level that most people won't even understand their construction, but they get it, like you're talking about. Or it's like musical, it's like prayer. It's something that hits us at a soul level. So, like on one level, it's like, you're left with the dilemma of, well, do I take violent action? It's like Hamlet. I think Hamlet was a big model for the character that I'm satirizing, who's most like me in this book, Phil Kroll, this failed ne'er-do-well wannabe professor, which is what I was when I first started writing this book. And I just was like, how do you take action? Do you take violent action? I don't think so, personally, because I was raised in a Christian cult. So you got to forgive everybody. But then at the same time, you don't. I mean, you got to say something. It's not just about docility. Like Jesus was also a radical,
Amy, going back to you, I'm curious what you think about in terms of themes. And I always think about how the writers that people look up to when I teach writing, and I think you've done some teaching as well, are often writers like, they'll say, oh, I read Emily Dickinson. I like this idea of just being able to be by myself and be a writer. And I think that like people like Poe and Hemingway are often attractive to guys who think that they might want to live a life that feels like a big life where they could be, drinking and partying and still manage to be a writer somehow. And sometimes women are attracted to that idea of just spending a lot of time alone, like Emily did. And I always feel like Walt Whitman is a better model because I feel like he was active in the world. So I'm curious, two things, I guess. One, what you think of as a good model as a writer. And the second one being what kind of takeaway you were hoping for in terms of the book in general.
Gosh, that's such a hard question to answer because I think I've just spent my whole creative life just trying to create spaces for myself where I can create. I started out in New York City, so I definitely chased adventure. I did not have an adventurous childhood. I've had a very strict Catholic childhood in a small town. There was not much but white Christianity around me. There was no conflict, or so I thought, in my family. Everything was perfect. And then when I got out of college and got to New York City, the world started to shatter around me into truth. And I kind of went through a real crisis of faith that led directly to me picking the guitar up and starting to write. I was angry at God, angry at religion, angry at structure. It was the 90s. I don't know what I was chasing. It wasn't fame. It was just high adventure. I was definitely like out there until 3 o'clock in the morning doing tequila shots with the theater crowd, with the rock and roll crowd, living who I had always envisioned I would hope to become. So I kind of put myself into the town. I grew up wanting to live in New York City and be a bohemian. I was obsessed by the 20s in New York City, by Edna St. Vincent Millay and all of those writers. I read everything in front of me. I went to acting school at the National Shakespeare Conservatory, so I thought of myself very highly as a professional actress in the classical tradition. But I was also a drunk folk singer, so it was really fun. It was like highbrow and lowbrow. I was living downtown, making no money, and doing Shakespeare off Broadway. So I was just chasing the thread of the experience, honestly. And because of that, I was really attracted to other artists that were experiential artists that I could find their life story in it. So like Patti Smith was a huge person for me. I got a chance to play music with Lenny Kaye and to hang out with a lot of that crowd downtown New York City. I got exposed early to Judy Collins, who discovered me, who took me on a ride and a tour of all of her crowd. So Tom Haxton was a mentor, and I've met Maria Muldaur and all those people, and I've found out about how crazy it was, like seriously debauchery and crazy and fun. Now that I'm older and I have a child and I live in Nashville, which is a quieter lifestyle. It's a house and yard lifestyle, whereas New York City is like, you're not inside that much. You're out as much as you can be. Nashville, you're in a lot. My ideal artistic space is a lot of silence. I'm way more, I don't want to say introverted, but protective of my creativity now that I'm getting older than I was back then. I was just throwing it out there back then. So I'm always like really interested in reading about writers who walk a lot in the woods or create their own writing space, things like that. I mean, I've got my little writing space. I've got my piano. I've got all my guitars. All my instruments are all in this room, but there's like shelves and shelves scattered of poetry. And if you could see my desk, it's a train wreck. I'm a messy creative. And every day is it a song or is it a poem or is it something else that I'm working on? And then I read biographies of my favorite writers like Dylan. I've gone down the Dylan train and I've met him once and it was really disappointing. Don't meet your heroes. You know, Joni Mitchell is not a really forthcoming human being about her process. But you were talking about the beats, and I've had the really great fortune of working with David Amram, who was one of the guys hanging out with Kerouac and those guys in that day. He wrote the script and the music for Manchurian Candidate. My God, it's just, he's a 95-year-old still working musician poet who is from the beat era. He's a genius, and he stays up till 4 o'clock in the morning smoking pot and jamming with a bunch of folk singers in a hotel room. And he's just trying to put himself in a space where spontaneity and improv is happening. Maybe my answer comes more from the jazz tradition. I want to be in a space of improv. So I'm playing with people and we have a bed that I can trust. Then I can just kind of fly around and then always come back to the scale, which is home. So maybe home is just this little writing space here. And then I'm just throwing things out into the world. And so the second part of your question is, what do I hope to accomplish? It's with everything that I do, whether it's a song or a poem or a story. I want to get, as a writer, I think I'm trying to get a little closer to the essence of the conundrum. I'm just trying to ask the question. And then I guess I put it out there to see if anybody else is out there asking it with me.
Like the big question.
Yeah, the big question. I'm trying to ask the big question. And what's my job as a writer to do? And it's funny, as a folk singer, I've been in this place lately of how do I, as a person who writes music in the folk tradition, I certainly have politics in the stories that I choose. What's my response and what's my responsibility to respond? I have a single coming out in May that's called The Reckoning, that's about Renee Good, how to sell my son this world when this is happening. And it's really a portrait of an artist. It's me. And I actually say, I'm coming to a blank page and I don't know what to say. And so I think that's kind of how I approach my world, is just to tell my truth and hope it's somebody else's truth and ask the big questions. It sounds real simple, but I don't really think that way.
I like what you were saying, though, about different parts of your life, because I think that there are parts of your life when you're living in one way and then you move on to a different part. When I was first going to New York all the time, too, for Red Hen, one of Red Hen's staff moved there and started running a bar. And that's kind of bad for me because that means free drinks. And so I remember showing up there and she was like, "Free drinks, Kate." And she was like, "What's your favorite drink right now?" And I said, "Mojitos." There were many mojitos, and it's just not a drink you should have maybe many of anyway. I don't think I've had a mojito since that night. That was a long night. But, I look back on that and I just think my life now is not that life anymore. I am just focusing on health and life and writing and sustaining Red Hen and sustaining culture and all that kind of thing, as you are in many ways too, because carrying people takes a lot of work and fewer mojitos.
Just want to just say as well, the fun of being in a playground like New York City artistically, and alcohol and drugs and all of that, so many drugs and alcohol and men and subway. It was just crazy. I love looking back on it now as a sober woman in my 50s, because it's like, well, that's where the meat of the story came from. Glad I survived it, because I might not have. But I wasn't telling the truth in my work back then. I can look back now and tell that story because I can stand above it soberly and tell the truth of it. I think my craft came later, and the craft helps me to know how to tell the truth and when to tell the truth and when to hide it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I always think about when I think about writers who are aspiring to that life, that Hemingway-ish life, is how honest is that life? So, Luke, I know in your book, your characters, at least some of them, are behaving badly. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on your characters' behavior, and is there someone or just some idea that you think, if you were talking to writers out there, this is the kind of thing that you think of really makes for a healthy writing life?
Well, it's funny because when you say they're behaving badly, those characters behaving badly, I immediately think of the poor and the addicted and the people who are abusing substances. But the ones who are really acting badly are the ones in their estates up in Bel Air, etc. So it's funny that like we're just programmed that way to immediately look down instead of up when we think about bad behavior, or even up and down in terms of socioeconomics. These words are loaded, but I can only say what I did, which is I'm also a sober writer. I can't imagine, it any other way. I think that what you said is so true, that like I wasn't able to capture what I was really experiencing when I was that close to the fire. But I do think it was very important that I went and did all the terrible things that I did. And it's sort of that like outlaw country. Like I like Sturgill Simpson a lot right
Love
now.
him.
And when you say Nashville, I think of Todd Snyder,
He was my friend. I love that guy.
my brother's favorite musician, and I listen to him all the time, every holiday. Like that's like we all get together, we think about my brother, we play Todd Snyder songs, Train Song or Corpus Christi Bay or anything. I mean, all the Cash Cabins, everything is amazing. And I think about like, what does it mean to be outlaw country, or what does it mean to be outlaw, as like white folk? And then how does that connect to other forms of like just positioning yourself outside of the dominant patriarchy, like hegemony as usual? Like, how do you align yourself? And for me, I mean, it's like we had this project about the Animal Liberation Front that didn't end up getting made with Joaquin Phoenix and Rooney Mara, not because I want to name drop, but because like I really wanted to do that project. I really wanted to see that succeed, because I think that like when you mistreat animals, and you have a system that exists off of the mistreatment of animals, whether that's vivisection or whether that's, food, I think you're basically habituating children and everyone to say like, oh, it's okay, let things suffer, let things be miserable, which isn't like, I'm not claiming a food stake, I'm not vegan, but what I am saying is like, I think it's important to look at Paul Beatty and look at Devil in Blue Dress and look at like other forms of resistance in the LA novel. And then also to just look at like, how do you identify. Earlier, I mentioned some folk singers I should have mentioned, like, growing up in the 90s, Ani DeFranco, and like I was raised on Joni Mitchell. You mentioned Judy Collins. That was my first concert in Dayton, Ohio. Like, how do you align yourself outside of the system? And like, for me, that was like, I called Ken Kesey when I was 13 on 411, back when you could just pick up a phone and say 411, hit the keys, and then say Ken Kesey, Pleasant Hills, Oregon, because I read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I talked to him for a while, and then I ended up being friends with Mountain Girl and that whole kind of dead scene, and taking a shitload of psychedelics. And I also broke my femur at 13. I got tackled by my male nanny, and my femur was in half, and then I was on morphine, and then I was on pills, and then I was on alcohol, and like I was just an alcoholic addict from the jump. It was important for me to get arrested and go to the mental institution and, be crazy and live in vehicles and like meet people for a place to stay, wink, wink, you know what I mean? Like just like get by. And all that like helped me to then write a book that accounts for everyone, because the last thing I want to read is some fucking book by a white author who only knows white wealthy people.
Absolutely. It seems that something all three of us have in common is growing up with white Christianity. I also grew up in a Christian cult, and it does seem like that can have a sort of scarring effect. So, Amy, do you feel like that was part of what led you to being a writer and artist? Like you were running away from that, moving in a different direction? I mean, in my case, obviously I left the cult and had to kind of create myself. I didn't really have a quote self, but part of that was that I really wanted to find books. Deprived of books, I'd had to sneak some books, and I wanted to find books. I felt like there was a whole world inside books that I was being deprived of. And so as soon as I got into that world, I wanted to be part of making that world too. Accidentally found out that I had all these family members who had PhDs and so on. So I guess having wandered out of the cult and gotten myself a PhD and starting a press was another happy accident. But I do think that there is something about rabid Christianity that pushes one in the direction of wanting to do something radical. So in your case, music was your first stop and writing this book. So do you feel like the Christianity pushed you there?
Yes, but in a different way than you said. So my relationship with the Catholic God, and very scary Catholic God, I come from a long line of Irish priests and nuns. It was actually a real deal in my family that the calling that you got was like not just a joke. Somebody was going to get the call. And my father, who grew up very non-denominational, small church Christian, like no music, no drinking, no dancing kind of Christian, he just never said a thing. Like he didn't participate. He just stayed home and watched football while we all had to go to the Catholic cult. And I hated it. So it was an angry God that I rejected, but I was always looking for that God. So I was trying to participate. So I was asking if I could be an altar girl. There was no altar girls. And they would say no. And I would ask why? Just because. And of course, it's like the patriarchal system. And I was like this burgeoning, 14-year-old feminist smartass. And I said, oh, is it because feudal land rights? That's why. And I was like, okay, you're grounded for a month. And so my mother, who God bless her, she saw something. And my grandmother also, I think both of them have that sort of latent, not artistic sensibility, but there's something about them that was so compassionate and attuned to me, and it was very different from my siblings. And I'm the oldest of four. I didn't belong anywhere that we were. My mom said to me, you can stop going to church as long as you do something for an hour while we're at church that connects you to something. And so I took my Walkman and I would put Mozart in or whatever I was currently listening to. I would walk through the mountains looking for God. I just rejected all religious tenets and decided that God wouldn't be anywhere that these men were telling me they were, but that I was allowed to go find God. And so God was a river and God was a bird. And when my grandmother passed, God was my grandmother talking to me. God were visions that I had. I was a very depressed kid. God was the depression that I had, which I loved because I was able to be by myself and cry a lot. And I would cry and write poetry and write and write. God was writing. It was this communion with a universal spirit of grief to me that was where I landed with God. So I just rejected what they told me God was, and I discovered my own. It was funny because I was always chasing structure around it. The thing that I found on my own by writing or by kayaking or by hiking, I could never find in a religious ceremony. I did every meditation course you can possibly do. I did yoga, this yoga, that yoga. I did all of that shit for years. Never found God. I got sober. The community that I got sober in basically said, find your own version of God and define it the way you want to define it. And I went, it's the first time anybody gave me permission. And I realized that I had been defining God by words and music my whole life. It sounds really like wooey, but I honestly feel like when I go to write something, it's a form of meditation and prayer. And of course, you got to go back and craft it intelligently. But there is that moment of just the big dump. And to me, that's my conversation with this other. And it's like when I was reading about enlightenment in my training, in college, and I took a lot of Buddhist classes, they would talk about enlightenment. And I would think, but isn't enlightenment that moment when you write the song and you finish it and you sing it and you get shivers up your spine and you start crying at your own work and you think, if I die tomorrow, I've done that and nobody needs to hear it. That to me is enlightenment.
Yeah, no, I think that when you are in a creative moment, that for those of us who are creators, that feels like a God moment, let there be light. So you also left a religious upbringing, but it sounds like you have something of that with you. So what do you feel you've brought to your creative life and what have you kicked to the curb?
I think I just sort of subverted the religion. I think I kept it while just behaving so horribly badly all the time that it sort of equals out. But I went to confession in Rome for the first time since first confession, and I just said everything that I'd done, and I was just sobbing and gagging, and this priest from Maryland is like, well, you ever think maybe you're an artist? And I was like, yeah, I'm a writer. And he goes, well, what do you expect?
Oh my God.
So I don't know. I too got sober and am sober and, they offered me that, you can make up your own. I don't know. I mean, there's something that I really resonate with the radicalism of that particular branch of faith that I was raised in. Like, I think if you actually dig what it says, you got to be so against the system. You got to be so for the underdog. You got to be so loving, forgiving. You got to be like a radical, and it's like nobody even does it right because you got to give away all your money. You got to like only spend your time helping other people. And I mean, I think that is sort of what I do with like the way that I approach writing. It's like, it's better be a gift because I'm not taking care of other people while I'm doing this. While I'm writing this book, which this one took 10 years, I'm not spending as much time with my family. I'm not spending as much time out on the streets, which I do, like helping the people who are, addicted or whatever, doing outreach or like making sandwiches. Like, I am sacrificing time that I could be spending helping the world, trying to help the world through this other thing. So it better be radical, it better be beautiful, it better be fun and funny and like be like affirming life, honoring what I call God by trying to take what has been given to all of us as our time here and like make it shine brighter, in dark times, like, and not by like proselytizing, but by like doing some fun and like making the physical world museum quality sentences, where it's like you could hang that on the wall, like you feel that, like that's acrylic, or like, what is that made out of? That's something. And then also being like, hey, when you're done reading this, you might want to rethink your whole fucking existence.
Amy, can you just tell us, as we're wrapping up here, how long did it take you to write your book?
Poetry book I wrote in 3 years. So it was 2.5 years in my MFA program. There's only one poem in that collection that's probably 20 years old because it's called Alexine, and it's about my niece who's now 26 years old. And it was written when she was 20 years old because it was written when she was 6. And it was one of my first poems, but it was my thesis. And then as we were talking about publishing it, I added some poems and took out some poems. So really, it was like a really intense period of 3 years of just churning out poetry constantly.
Well, it's been amazing having this conversation with both of you. I can't wait for you guys to get to meet in person. Amy is touring all the time, so hopefully you guys will be in the same city. Working with both of you has been absolutely a joy, an adventure, every bit of it. And everyone on the Red Hen team has loved working with you guys, and there's just going to be more and more. So thank you so much. Let's keep this party going.
Thank you for listening to Red Hen Radio, the podcast where independent literature takes flight. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join us once a month for an in-depth look into publishing as we share interviews, resources, and advice for readers and writers. Keep up to date by subscribing to the Red Hen Radio podcast on your favorite listening platform. Join us on Substack for a detailed feature of our episodes, plus additional resources. Follow us on social media at Red Hen Press to stay updated on our newest episodes, latest books, industry news, and literary events. This program is brought to you by Red Hen Press, Inc., a nonprofit publisher of diverse stories. Interviews are unscripted and are edited for clarity. The views of guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Red Hen Press or its staff. Special thank you to our supporters who have generously contributed to the making of this podcast. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you as well to our Red Hen podcasting team, Samantha Diaz on media and marketing, Piper Gorley on sound editing, and Kate Gale and Toby Harper-Petrie on the mic. Tremendous thank yous to our special guests for their generosity of time and wisdom. For more information, find us at redhenpress.com. In the meantime, keep reading, keep writing, and keep dreaming. Talk to you soon.